Okay, excellent. So yeah, very cool. I've been a fan since the beginning, and it's just great to see this all coming up. So what is it about the Saints catalog that makes you think that there's a market for this? What is it about this music that endures from these first three albums?
Uh, well, we just sort of went on what people were saying, really. I mean, we wouldn't put the records out without people wanting to buy it, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so there were, there was enthusiasm for the project, and I like the material. It's had a life sort of long beyond what I would have anticipated, kind of thing. So I'm happy with that.
And who was driving this idea to have Mark Arm involved? Obviously, there's a similarity with the MC5 situation, right?
Yeah, a mutual friend suggested Mark. We were looking for a singer for the project, and it just made a lot of sense. I have a lot of regard for what Mark does, and he was really keen, and he sort of, he had a familiarity with the material, which I think just made it really easy, you know, to kind of capture
Mm-hmm.
what we did in those days, without it being kind of uh, approached as a tribute or anything like that. It's just basically we're just playing that material in the way that we all sort of agree it should be played.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there any of it that surprised you in terms of how difficult it was to do, or hard to get everybody on the same page about, or even indeed that you changed the arrangements of?
I changed a few arrangements, but in a fairly subtle kind of way, because I didn't want to take it too far from where it was in a lot of ways. I didn't want to modernize it too much, and I didn't want to put too much uh, sort of interpretation in terms of hindsight. When you've recorded something or when you've played something and you go back to it years later, you can kind of say, yeah, that wasn't, I could do better than that. I
Mm-hmm.
could have had the guitar and tune on that solo or something like that. We didn't do that. It was sort of like reappraising what was actually done. I found it a really educational process in a lot of ways, because there were things that I did when I was starting out that I've kind of just moved away from, and some of them are really good. So I'm sort of reincorporating things in what I do in my newer material in a strange kind of way. No, no, the process was sort of just basically look at what the band did and how the band did it, musically anyway, and I think the way those things were done was basically the what kind of keeps it alive these days. So to rearrange it, to present it in a different way, that doesn't really make any sense to me. I can do that anytime, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm always interested in this idea of who invented punk. I actually wrote a book called Who Invented Heavy Metal, and I've been picking away at one about punk. And just wondering about in 1974, did you guys have much of this material, or what did you guys sound like in 1974?
Well, interestingly enough, there's a record. It's not in print at the moment, which is called "The Most Primitive Band in the World Live from the Twilight Zone," which was recorded in my parents' garage, which gives you a pretty good idea of what the band sounded like. And yeah, we had most of the material that's on the first LP. That was, I think, the newest song would have been "Kissing Cousins." Oddly enough, that was something that we just threw in at the last moment. We hadn't even been playing that.
Mm-hmm.
So all the originals, "Messing with the Kid," "Nights in Venice," they all go back to 1973 when we started out. Stranded, One Way Street. What else is on it?
Yeah, Wild About
Erotic Neurotic.
You, and yeah.
Yeah, they're all sort of mostly sort of 73, 74. When we went in to do the record, I thought it was sort of important to record, you know, where the band was at that stage, and we had become, even though we weren't playing very much, we'd sort of become a very distinctive, you know, the band sound had evolved, and so to get the older songs out of the way made sense to me. That was what we were. The newer ones, you know, I just thought, well, you know, they're not as developed yet. The newer ones, a lot of them ended up on the second album, so we were sort of about 18 months ahead of ourselves in terms of material in a lot of ways.
Do you remember what month I'm Stranded No Time, the first single, came out? What month in 76?
Yeah, look, I, I picked up the finished copies on the 22nd of August.
Okay. Yeah.
So I have the receipts for that. So
Right.
that's what we're going on, you know. Like when I had copies in my hand, that was the release kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
first thing I did was sort of, you know, go home, play it, and get blown away by it, tell everyone else,
Yeah.
you know, and then within days I was just sending the copies out. So that's the release, I guess, around
Yeah.
there, you know, August.
And
August.
what was making you guys sound that way? I mean, were you influenced? Did you know what was going on in the punk world, or were you influenced by the Angels or AC/DC or Buffalo or Colored Balls or any of those bands? Or
I was influenced by a lot of bands, you know. Not really AC/DC. Colored Balls, I sort of had mixed feelings about. They were sort of a pub rock band a lot of the times, you know. Like I didn't see them live, and I don't remember hearing God, you know, that tune that they do, Guitar Overdose, which I really like. But had I heard that, maybe that would have influenced me. But I didn't hear that at the time. There were most of the influences that I was drawing on were sort of older things. I had this theory that, you know, I really loved all these bands when I was a young child, like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and that kind of thing. And I kind of just wanted to see what inspired them. And so you know, the Saints in a lot of ways drew on a lot of 50s influences, Bo Diddley and that kind of thing. Just something about the rhythm in those days that was sort of closer to what I thought I wanted to sound like, you know. And so, you know, the way Ivor plays the drums it's not, he's not like a 70s rock drummer in a lot of ways. It's sort of, he's got this odd kind of thing that we sort of worked out in the garage, and that makes the band sort of sound distinct. In terms of being aware of what was going on in the rest of the world, well, there wasn't very much. You know, I was aware of the New York Dolls; they were great. I sort of initially hesitated buying the first Dolls album because I thought they might just be another sort of glam band or something. And I said, you know, I liked it, glam stuff like Gary Glitter and T-Rex and stuff, but I didn't think I needed any more of it. But then, you know, one day there was just nothing. I had some spare money and nothing else to buy, so I bought the Dolls album and I thought it was brilliant. And yeah, so we were aware of that, but there wasn't really, you know, I mean, out of the UK, you would have had Dr. Feelgood, who I like, but you know, I wouldn't say that they really influenced me substantially, even though I think what's his name, Wilco Johnson is just, you know, like the Iron Claw, just an amazing guitar player.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, do you think there's some credence to the theory that this maybe is considered a punk classic because the guitars, you know, even though there's definitely a retro vibe on it. I mean, would you characterize the production as the guitars being way up in the mix kind of thing?
Oh yes, for sure. When I say that I was sort of drawing on that older music, I never wanted us to sound like
Mhm.
an old band. It had to be new. It's just sort of where I was drawing the influences from. It kind of, and I still wanted it to be a fairly distinctive kind of thing, and we all did.
Mhm.
So yeah, the guitars are pretty loud, but that's the way we were on stage. I think what you hear on the first record, it's live in the studio pretty much. I think Chris over did dub a couple of vocals and I did a couple of extra guitar parts, but it's essentially a live recording and a
Mhm.
sort of a document of what the band was in Brisbane in 1976.
Yeah, yeah. And we just lost Brian James recently. Did you know Brian from The Damned?
Um, not really. I think I might have met him once. I know that he played with Chris at one stage for a short period of time, but no, I didn't really know him.
Okay, all right. And how did you get Algie into the band? And how did that work out? What was he like? What did he contribute?
Um, it was actually really easy. Kim, our first bass player, no, not actually our first bass player, but the bass player that played on the first album,
Mhm.
uh, had left the band, and Algie was the younger brother of our roadie, and Algie had seen the band a few times. And when it became obvious that Kim was going to go, that uh, Algie's brother just said, "Oh, my younger brother would like to try out," and he did. And we didn't try out anybody else. He kind of had all the material down, and he was a really great player. He was, I think, 2 years younger than me or so. So he seemed like he was a kid. He was like 17 or 18 or something,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
very, very enthusiastic. Completely sort of different in personality to the rest of us, and he sort of became our little mascot. We used to put him on the top of the van when we'd come into town. He'd
Mhm.
wave at the girls, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And what would you characterize as the personality of Eternally Yours as an album versus the debut?
Um, well, it's more expensive. There's after we did the first album, I didn't really think that we could repeat it. I think that was sort of like we gave that everything, and to kind of do it again exactly the same way seemed to, in a way, to betray the purity of what I thought we'd done. And plus you sort of you just learn things. Like I mean, we had no studio experience before the first album. The only recordings we did were on a mono cassette player where I just basically set up a little microphone and pressed pressed record.
Mhm.
um, to the whole concept of multi-track recording and stuff like that. Also, with the second album, we had a bit more time in the studio. The first album we did over a weekend, and the second album, I think we had we had 2 weeks and did about a week of recording, did rough mixes, and then had a break, and then decided to redo a lot of it. And so we had it like overall, I think the second album was maybe took 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks or something in the studio, and it's got acoustic guitar on it, it's got keyboard on it, it's got horns on it, which to some people would just scream out, avoid at all costs. But I think it's if they're the people that really love the rawness of the first album often don't sort of get where the band kind of moved very rapidly. Um, but that's what we wanted to do, and if you love the first album, great, it's there. But I didn't think we could outdo the first album by doing the same thing, basically. So to me it just seemed like we had to kind of start exploring things, and the opportunity was there, and that's what we did.
Did you feel part of the punk scene or did you feel disdain for it? Did you feel like outsiders?
I think like initially, I mean, the Saints probably I can't imagine that we would have gone on to record any of the albums. We recorded the single, but I can't imagine that we would have gone to London and recorded the records that we did there if the punk thing hadn't have happened in the UK. So, there's it definitely would have things would have transpired in a completely different sort of way. But I liked a lot of the early punk, and then very rapidly it became a kind of a formula, and it became in some quarters, I guess, a fairly almost sort of regimented approach or something, and that was nothing that I wasn't interested in that sort of thing. And I certainly wasn't going to be no one in the band. We were veterans. We weren't going to be told by youngsters how to look or sound, kind of thing. So I had disdain for some of it. I really liked some of it. Yeah. But I was also discovering a lot of other music when I got to London. Like London was just a goldmine, so to speak, of music, of records. Stuff that I'd never seen before, and there was tons of it. So it was an inspiring time.
And who were your label bosses at the time? Were you run out of the UK or the US sire, or who was telling you what to do, if anybody?
No one was. People tried to, but that would have been London, okay. Harvest in London. The deal with Sire was with EMI Australia, and we got out of that deal. And Sire released the first two albums, but they didn't release the third. I mean, the US albums always released a bit later than they were everywhere else. So by the time the third album, it might have got a release in the States, I don't know, but the band had already split. Yeah. No, I mean, it had the band not split, then it may have been released, but right. It didn't happen. And I don't think either of the first two albums sold in the States at all, because there are a lot of cutout copies that flooded Australia a couple of years later.
Really?
So, yeah.
Interesting, yeah. And what are your favorite tracks on the second album to perform on this set of dates, and why? What are your favorites on here as a guitarist, I suppose?
I never really look at it as a guitar player. I sort of look at it as an overall kind of song. I just see what I do as part of that presentation. Right. But in terms of guitar solos, N.O. Your Product, I think that I really like that song. We do that has hardly ever been played. I don't think we played it live much back in the day. We're doing that, and that sounds fantastic. Mark does a killer job on that, and it's a hard song to sing. What else do we do? Misunderstood, we do Lost and Found, we do Know Your Product, of course, This Perfect Day. Oh, they're all gems, mate. They're all and we play as much of them, and try to change it around a little bit, I guess. But we cover the three albums in a fairly coherent kind of way, I think.
Right. And what is the personality of Prehistoric Sounds?
Quite different, very sort of extrapolative, I suppose. It's one of the first things that I decided to do was that, the power of the recordings of a lot of the earlier recordings that we'd done was it was very guitar driven. And so I thought I'll just take all the distortion off the guitar, make it really clean, add an acoustic, and just open the sound, and still, and it was sort of a challenge, like to be able to do a powerful record like that is harder, because as soon as you've got the guitar kind of in there, I'm a fairly strong guitar player, and I know how to achieve that, but I wanted to do something else, and yeah, Prehistoric Sounds is that's came out 18 months after the first album, or the first single rather, and we had changed. It was sort of developing. It was hell bent for leather in terms of like just exploring what you could do in the studio, what you could do as a writer. It was a really, really great record from my perspective. It's too long. There's a couple of songs on the album that shouldn't have that should have just been B-sides, but we knew it was going to be the last album, and so it just all got chucked on.
And how was Chris liking this new direction versus you? And how does Algie fit into this? Are you still getting along with Algie?
Yeah, Algie was fine. He apparently he wasn't keen on the direction. He sort of mentioned afterwards and thought it was. I can't remember what his reasons were, but it wasn't sort of hard rock enough, I guess. Chris was also a little ambivalent about it. I think it took him a long time to come to terms with that record. There were differences sort of coming up quite often, but we got it done, and for the fact that Chris was so ambivalent about it, I think it's probably his greatest vocal performance and some of his best lyrics. So yeah, he worked well under pressure, under duress.
Right. How would you describe him as a vocalist?
Look, I think Chris was up there with the best rock and roll singers anywhere, really. I mean, I'd known Chris for a few years, well, 2, maybe 3 years before the band started, and I had no idea that he could sing. So that was a really great and very pleasant surprise. We never, I was writing songs and stuff, but I didn't really tell him about it. It was sort of the way it came together was really good.
Mm-hmm. I mean, back then, was there any? I mean, were you a glam band or were you looking at glam artists in 72, 73 in Australia? That weird look of glam that glam had back then. I mean,
not to apply to ourselves, but yeah, I mean, that stuff was around, and I liked some of it, but I was never taken by the look. I always thought the Satins and stuff, you could do it well. Alice Cooper sort of, I thought, looked good, as a band. It didn't kind of, but Gary Glitter and those, I love Gary Glitter's recordings, but the way that the image didn't appeal to me particularly. I thought it was hilarious, but
Yeah. Yeah, the look was a disaster everywhere, really. I mean, some of the most god awful looking bands came out of the whole glam scene, that's for sure. But I mean, flash forward 5 years. I mean, how did you feel about the punk fashion thing, and did you guys participate in that?
No, not at all. I think it was obviously a kind of a bought kind of look in a lot of ways. I know you could do it yourself quite easily, but but the whole it was just too uniform. It was a bit embarrassing. It's just there's no way that any of us would have changed the way we look because of that.
Yeah. Was there ever a chance that you would end up with Vanda and Young and Albert Productions and all that? Did you have much dovetailing with AC/DC or the Angels?
No, none whatsoever. No. They would. I mean, we played a show with AC/DC at on the Gold Coast in Queensland, and their manager didn't like us, sort of thing. So no, there's no real connection there.
Mm-hmm. And so, who did invent punk?
Well, like I was aware of the word when we started, but I kind of knew it in reference to sort of 60s American garage bands, so that for me was kind of punk. And I had no issue with it. But who invented punk? God, I don't know. I mean, it's rock and roll. It's kind of it's. I see the threads kind of thing, and to me, I don't know, John Lee Hooker or somebody, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's funny. I mean, you can peg it to albums or you can peg it to singles. I guess if you peg it to singles a little bit, you guys that's considered a pretty early single, August 76, right?
Yeah. Well, it just sort of depends. Like I guess there was something happening musically across the Western world anyway
Mm-hmm.
around that time, and yeah, we
Yeah.
were at the forefront of it. And it was sort of at a time when, unless you were in one of the major music centers, there wasn't really, any way that, I mean, we had no idea what going to CBGB's was like or anything like that. We made our own club in a house, which our rehearsal room we turned into a club called Club 76, which lasted for a few months.
Hmm.
It wasn't a licensed venue, it wasn't a legal venue, and we got closed down by the city council health department, but for not having enough fire escapes and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, we were doing what we were doing. Whether that kind of invented punk or not, I've never
Mm-hmm.
made any claims on that sort of
Yeah.
basis. I always acknowledged the people that inspired me, so I was never part of that UK. This is ground zero. Nothing good has ever happened before. The Sex Pistols or something like that. I just thought that was just rubbish, stupid and willfully ignorant.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
I think I was always more of a musical historian than.
Yeah. Have you ever it's interesting, you could just go look at it. Maybe you have already, but there's this Orcs Loft television rehearsal from 1974, and there's Ramones playing in rehearsal places in 1974, all on YouTube. And it's pretty
Oh,
interesting. It really looks like
yeah,
the kind of a good ground zero kind of thing. And I
yeah,
sure you guys were doing that too, right? So
yeah. Well, I mean, we didn't have the video
yeah,
cameras or anything like that. We had
yeah.
a mono cassette player, and eventually we one of the people that was sort of close to the band started feeling confident enough with his photography to start taking photographs. But that was sort of like late 1975, so we have very little visual evidence, but we have some audio um, documents of the band from that time. But yeah, it I don't know, there is overlap, like I can acknowledge that, but I still think that the Saints kind of stand alone, the way that any sort of good band kind of stands alone. Like the Ramones, to me, that people made comparisons to the Saints, and that they're a completely different entity. And that's what makes them last. And I think that's maybe the Saints sort of got overlooked, I think, at the time, because we didn't stay together long enough.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't tour the third album, and we only did one quick tour for the second album, sort of thing. So, had that been different, maybe everything else would have been different. But I think people are discovering it at their own pace, and they without any hype around it, people can kind of come to it, and or not, however they take it, sort of thing.
Yeah. And what's the direction of the new solo album?
Well, I've done a recording with Jim White, the who people might know from being the drummer with the Dirty Three and Cat Power and 10 million other at the Heart Quartet currently. Uh, it's basically a recording of what we did uh, when Jim was kind of stranded in Australia because of COVID restrictions, and I had been wanting to work with Jim for quite a long time, and just ask him because I knew he was in the country, and we put a tour together, and it went really, really well. We didn't get very much rehearsal at all because of the COVID restrictions would sort of they'd close a state for a few days, and so you couldn't travel, that sort of thing. So we were working around all these various regulations. We had, I think, a day and a half of rehearsal, and we went out, did the tour. We'd never played together before, and it was just fantastic. It was, and we just felt we had to get what we were doing on stage onto record, which is what we did. We had enough material, I think, for a double LP, but we decided it might be a bit overkill for a new act.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you've obviously been very prolific and stuff. I mean, is this going back to the rapid changing in the band? Is where do you think it would have gone if, say, Chris had got his way and you kept the band together?
I think if the band had it wouldn't have been a matter of anyone getting their way so much. It would have been a matter of Chris and I agreeing to acknowledge that both of us were sort of doing things that were moving in a different direction to each other, and could those two sort of directions be sort of rejoined, and re-entwined or something to create something else. I think had we been able to do that, I think it would have gone in a really really exciting sort of way. I mean, I can kind of see it now how I'd approach it. At the time I didn't, but so I think we would have recorded some really interesting, really unique records. But it would have really meant both of us being prepared to kind of totally accept what the other was doing, and not, and that's an easy perspective coming at it from my aged vantage point kind of thing. When you're young, you kind of can be a lot more volatile, I think, and hot-headed.
Were you surprised with the direction it took over the next few albums? And then he had a kind of a hit with the band, Prodigal Son era, right?
Yeah. Was I surprised? No, I mean, the very early records that he did without me, there's sort of little elements of songs that we were doing in, like outtakes of Prehistoric Sounds and stuff like that. So that didn't really surprise me.
Got a feel here. We got this.
All right. Oh, right. Look at that.
A Little Madness to Be Free, right? And
yeah,
sort of bootleg album. The Prodigal Son here, right?
You got them all. So okay. I'm not all that crazy about Prodigal Son. I actually don't like it at all. But
Live in a Mud Hut. Yeah, this was the one that was a bit of a hit up here in Canada and the States, right?
And all autographed too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, but I mean, obviously they're an offshoot of Prehistoric Sounds more than the first two albums, right? Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, Chris went in by the time of Prodigal Son, I don't really feel that I should be critiquing his albums. Really, that one didn't appeal to me at all. I thought it was a real. I didn't like the sound of it. I didn't like the style of it. It was sort of like a very AOR kind of rock album to me, and I've never particularly been engaged by that sort of music. So if I had been involved, it would have been it would have sounded different.
Yeah,
That's all
yeah,
I can say.
yeah. So everybody's health's good. Ivor's health's good. I mean, you can see yourself doing this for a little while, or
Hopefully,
yeah,
hopefully we're contracted to tour, so hopefully.
yeah, yeah. Well, hopefully we'll see you
Yeah,
in November and up in Toronto way. So that would be very
yeah.
cool.
Who if you haven't been taken over by the states,
Yeah, really. Yeah. Oh,
yeah,
that's
it's
absolutely front
I
page news every day here. So
yeah. Well, you know, depending on what happens. Yeah, we're looking forward to the tour.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Whatever country it'll be in, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. Funny. Okay, well, thank you very much, Ed. This has been very cool. I'll let you get on with your day, but yeah, we'll put together a little press and thank you for all this. And thank you for the great music and stuff. So
Well, thank you. Thanks for the time.
all right, talk to you later.
Cheers.
Bye
Bye
now.
bye.